Diplomacy has always been a game of power. Alliances, whispered negotiations, and carefully chosen words. For centuries, global politics operated behind closed doors, where decisions that shaped the world were made in dimly lit rooms, not blasted across social media. But something has changed. In Washington, diplomacy is no longer a quiet conversation. It's a performance. And today, South Africa finds itself at the center of the stage, facing an expulsion unlike any seen before. The message arrived not through a diplomatic channel, a discreet back-channel discussion, or a social media post. Blunt, public, and humiliating. Ebrahim Rasool is no longer welcome in the United States.
U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has posted on X that Ambassador Ebrahim Rasool is no longer welcome in the United States of America.
The order came directly from Secretary of State Marco Rubio, mid-flight from a G7 meeting in Canada. No formal discussion, no warning, just a declaration, fired off in less than 280 characters. And just like that, South Africa's highest diplomat in Washington was out. Persona non grata, unwelcome, ordered to leave by Friday. But this was no ordinary expulsion. This wasn't about a crime. This wasn't about national security. This wasn't about espionage, sabotage, or anything that would normally justify the highest diplomatic insult in international relations. This was about a speech, a simple webinar, thousands of miles away in Johannesburg, where Rasool dared to say something Washington didn't want to hear, something that shook the fragile identity of Trump's America. Now, Rasool is gone, and the world is watching, because this isn't just about one man. This is about who gets to speak, who gets to challenge power, and who gets silenced. And if a South African ambassador can be expelled over mere words, who's next? Let's talk about it. There are many ways to end a diplomatic relationship. Some are subtle, a quiet recall, a carefully worded statement, a behind-the-scenes negotiation that allows both sides to save face. And then, there is the nuclear option, persona non grata. It is a phrase that carries the weight of centuries. It is not just a dismissal, it is a public branding, a diplomatic scarlet letter that signals total rejection. When a country declares someone persona non grata, they are doing more than just expelling them. They are erasing them from the diplomatic equation entirely. And that is exactly what Washington did to Ebrahim Rasool. For most people, being asked to leave a country might seem like a personal inconvenience. But in the world of diplomacy, this is the equivalent of a declaration of war in words. A move is so severe that it is usually reserved for spies, criminals, or those who have directly undermined the host nation's security. But Rasool? His so-called crime was a speech. The U.S. didn't expel him because he leaked state secrets. He wasn't accused of engaging in covert operations. He wasn't caught bribing officials or conspiring against the government. No, his only offense was saying something Washington found uncomfortable. And that raises a disturbing question. Since when did words alone justify such an extreme diplomatic move? Declaring an ambassador persona non grata is not a routine action. It is a calculated diplomatic strike, a message to an entire nation that it has crossed a line. His signaled, when countries have used this measure, it has signaled the collapse of relations, often preceding severe political or economic retaliation. In 2018, Britain expelled 23 Russian diplomats after accusing Moscow of poisoning a former spy. In 2021, the U.S. expelled 10 Russian diplomats over election interference allegations. In 1986, the Reagan administration expelled 80 Soviet diplomats in one of the largest Cold War diplomatic purges. Each of these cases had one thing in common. They involved national security threats, espionage, or outright acts of aggression. But here, there was no war, no sabotage, no leaked intelligence, just a South African ambassador speaking on a webinar. And yet Washington decided this was enough to invoke the most extreme diplomatic punishment. Why? Because this wasn't just about Rasool. This was about controlling the narrative. Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. In diplomacy, words are everything. Wars have started because of them. Nations have collapsed because of them. And sometimes a single sentence spoken at the wrong time or in the wrong place can be seen as a threat to an empire's authority. Rasool didn't call for revolution. He didn't issue a direct challenge to Washington. What he did was much more dangerous. He pointed out a truth that America is desperate to ignore. He spoke about the changing demographics of the United States, a future where white Americans would no longer be the majority. To the rest of the world, this is simply a demographic shift, an inevitable result of immigration, globalization, and time. But to Trump's America, an administration built on nostalgia for an era of white dominance, this was an attack. When an ambassador openly acknowledges that power structures are shifting, the old order is on borrowed time, and that is a reality Washington is not ready to accept. By expelling Rasool, the Trump administration is sending a message, not just to South Africa, but to any nation that dares to challenge its influence. It is not just a punishment, it is a warning. It is not just an expulsion, it is a power move. It is not just about Rasool, it is about who controls the global conversation. Because if an ambassador can be removed for speaking uncomfortable truths, what does that mean for the rest of the world? What happens when journalists, activists, and politicians realize that Washington will no longer tolerate dissenting voices, no matter how respected, no matter how diplomatic? This is not just about one man leaving Washington. This is about who gets to speak and who gets silenced. But in the world of international politics, no action goes unanswered. South Africa now faces a decision. Does it accept the humiliation and move on, or does it strike back? Typically, when one country expels a diplomat, the other retaliates in kind. We've seen this play out between the US and Russia, between China and Canada, and between Britain and Iran. If South Africa chooses to respond, it could expel American diplomats from Pretoria, forcing Washington to deal with its public embarrassment. Or it could take a more subtle approach, cutting back diplomatic cooperation, reducing intelligence sharing agreements, or even strengthening its ties with China and Russia as a direct counterbalance to US influence. Because here's the bigger picture. South Africa is not a small, powerless nation that depends on Washington for survival. It is a key member of BRICS, a growing economic and political alliance that is increasingly challenging Western dominance. And this expulsion, it might just push Pretoria to fully align itself with the new global order, one where Washington no longer calls the shots. The consequences of this diplomatic rupture won't be felt overnight. But make no mistake, this is a turning point. For decades, the US has assumed that it alone decides who stays and who goes, who is legitimate and who is cast out. But the world is changing. And as South Africa weighs its next move, one question lingers. Is Washington still as powerful as it thinks it is? Apart from this matter isn't that simple. Diplomatic expulsions don't happen in a vacuum. They are never random, never isolated. They are always part of a bigger game, a chess move designed to weaken, intimidate, or silence an opponent. And in this case, Rasool's expulsion is just another piece in a much larger puzzle. Because this was never just about Rasool. It was never just about a speech. This was about South Africa. And more importantly, this was about the Trump administration punishing a nation that refuses to fall in line. But what did South Africa do? The United States has expelled diplomats before. But South Africa is not a country that typically lands in Washington's crosshairs. So why now? Why, in the middle of global instability, did the Trump administration decide that South Africa's ambassador had to be expelled? The answer lies in a growing rift between Washington and Pretoria, one that has been brewing for years but has now exploded into the open. For decades, South Africa was considered one of Washington's strongest diplomatic partners in Africa. Despite its history of anti-colonial resistance, it maintained strategic ties with the US, especially in trade and security. But something changed. In the last few years, South Africa has been drifting away from the West, not by accident, but by deliberate choice. It has strengthened its ties with China and Russia, prioritizing BRICS over Western-led alliances. It has openly challenged US foreign policy, refusing to blindly support Washington's stance on global conflicts. It has taken an independent approach to diplomacy, refusing to play by America's rules. And for Trump, that was unacceptable. Rasool's expulsion didn't happen in isolation. It was the second strike in a much larger attack. The first strike came just a month earlier, when Donald Trump signed an executive order cutting U.S. funding to South Africa. The order was blunt. It accused the South African government of enforcing anti-white policies, a reference to South Africa's land expropriation law. Second, aligning itself with U.S. enemies, specifically Iran and Palestinian resistance movements. Third, failing to support American geopolitical interests. It was a deliberate escalation, designed to send a message: if you don't play by Washington's rules, you will be punished. And Pretoria's response? Defiance. South Africa made it clear. It would not be intimidated, it would not reverse its policies, and it would not bend to Washington's demands. So Trump took the next step. If cutting aid didn't force South Africa into submission, then it was time to humiliate it on the world stage. And that's exactly what the expulsion of Rasool was designed to do. In Washington, diplomacy is often about power, but sometimes it's about dominance. Trump's foreign policy has always been built on personal grudges, public humiliation, and open displays of force. He doesn't just want to win, he wants his opponents to lose publicly. This is why Rasool wasn't quietly recalled. Rasool wasn't given the chance to negotiate his exit. Rasool was publicly branded persona non grata on social media before his government was even informed. This wasn't just an expulsion. It was a global spectacle designed to send a message, not just to South Africa, but to every country that dares to challenge Washington's authority. Because in Trump's world, power is measured in obedience, and South Africa's refusal to bow down made it a prime target. There's another factor that cannot be ignored. Trump's decision to expel Rasool was not just political, it was deeply racial. His administration had already framed South Africa's land expropriation policies as an attack on white farmers. It had embraced right-wing narratives that painted South Africa's black-led government as corrupt, incompetent, and anti-Western. And in this context, Rasool, a black Muslim diplomat from a government that Trump openly despised, became the perfect target. Would Washington have expelled an ambassador from a European country over a simple speech? Would a Canadian diplomat be treated this way? Would a French or German envoy be given the same punishment? The answer is clear. This was not just about diplomacy. This was about who Washington sees as expendable. Rasool's expulsion is not an isolated event. It is part of a wider geopolitical struggle, one that goes far beyond South Africa. At its core, this is about the collapse of Western dominance. China is rising. Russia is strengthening its influence. BRICS is becoming a direct challenger to U.S. hegemony. And South Africa? It is right in the middle of it all. This is why the U.S. can't afford to lose control of Pretoria. Because if South Africa fully aligns itself with BRICS, it will send a message to the rest of Africa. We don't need Washington anymore. And that is Trump's biggest fear. Because for decades, Africa has been a battleground for influence, a place where the U.S. could dictate policies, control economies, and use aid as leverage. But that system is falling apart. Countries like Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are rejecting Western control. Nations like Ethiopia and Kenya are building stronger ties with China. And now, South Africa is standing firm against Washington's pressure. The old world order is crumbling, and the Trump administration is panicking. By expelling Rasool, Washington thought it was sending a message. But what if South Africa sends a message back? What if it expels American diplomats in retaliation? What if it cuts security cooperation with the U.S.? What if it moves even closer to China and Russia, accelerating America's decline in Africa? Because in the end, this isn't just about who gets expelled, it's about who gets to decide the future. And as South Africa weighs its response, one thing is becoming clear. The days of American dominance in Africa are numbered. In the end, we would like to bring your focus on how this expulsion was ordered. Diplomacy, once an art of patience and precision, is now dictated by 140 character decrees and reactionary social media storms. The world of formal negotiations, confidential meetings, and carefully crafted communiques has been replaced with a much simpler, much cruder approach. Foreign policy by tweet. In an era where leaders weaponize social media, Diplomatic expulsions no longer happen behind closed doors. They happen in real time, broadcast to the world like a celebrity feud. And that's exactly how South Africa's ambassador found out he was no longer welcome in the United States. It wasn't through a discreet phone call from the State Department. It wasn't through a private meeting with high-ranking officials. It wasn't even through a formal diplomatic letter, the way such matters have always been handled. No, Ebrahim Rasool learned of his expulsion the same way the rest of the world did, from a tweet. It happened mid-flight. Somewhere over the Atlantic Ocean, Secretary of State Marco Rubio was returning from a G7 foreign ministers meeting in Canada. Normally, such a trip would be followed by closed-door debriefings, classified discussions, and strategic planning. But instead, Rubio took out his phone, opened X, and posted a bombshell announcement. South Africa's ambassador is no longer welcome in the United States. No warning, no courtesy, no diplomacy. Just a public execution of South Africa's diplomatic standing in front of the entire world. It was a new low, even by Washington standards. And it sent a clear message, not just to South Africa, but to every country watching. To understand the full impact of this move, you have to look at how diplomacy used to work. In the past, when a country expelled an ambassador, it was done with precision and secrecy. The process followed a structured protocol designed to avoid unnecessary conflict. The foreign minister or State Department would summon the ambassador for a private meeting. A formal diplomatic note would be delivered, stating the reasons for expulsion. The country would be given time to quietly arrange the ambassador's departure without unnecessary spectacle. This was not out of kindness, but because diplomacy is a long game. Even when relations soured, nations avoided unnecessary public embarrassment because today's enemy could be tomorrow's ally. But Trump-era politics doesn't work that way. In this new version of diplomacy, humiliation is the point. Rubio's decision to announce Rasool's expulsion on Twitter wasn't just about removing him. It was about making it as public and painful as possible. And this strategy isn't limited to South Africa. When Trump pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal, he didn't notify his European allies beforehand. He announced it on Twitter, leaving world leaders scrambling to react. When the US declared that China was a national security threat, it was done through a thread of tweets, instead of through formal diplomatic engagement. Even NATO allies have been publicly ridiculed by US officials on social media, rather than through back-channel discussions. This is not diplomacy. This is social media warfare, where the goal isn't just to win, but to control the narrative. When Rubio pressed tweet, he wasn't just announcing an expulsion, he was shaping global opinion. Because in the age of social media, whoever controls the narrative controls the world. The moment Rubio's tweet went out, news outlets picked it up within minutes. Within an hour, the far-right Breitbart ran an article, framing Rasool as an anti-American race baiter. By the next morning, South African officials were forced to respond, not on their terms, but in reaction to a social media post. This is how modern information warfare works. First, you control the timing. Rubio dropped the news when he knew it would get maximum media attention. Then, you frame the narrative. Rasool wasn't expelled for speaking the truth. He was expelled because he was hateful toward the US. Finally, you flood the conversation. By the time South Africa had a chance to react, the damage had already been done. By using Twitter instead of traditional diplomacy, the US didn't just remove Rasool, they made sure the world saw it through their lens. And that is why this expulsion is so dangerous. But not just for South Africa, but for everyone. Do you think the US needs to think before it says or does anything? Let us know in the comment section. Was this a sensible decision? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.